that I said in chapter 3 of that book, that Jews were instrumental to the rise of Bolshevism in the Soviet Union, that it would not have happened without them, that they formed much of the elite of the early Bolshevik movement. They were the ones that manned the bureaucracies. They were very powerful in the secret police.
The fact that most of the world is ignorant and uncaring about this enormous crime is proof that the global media is in the hands of the perpetrators. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, an industrial mass murder that the world has never seen. And the role, ironically and strangely, as the Jewish Telegraph even admits in this paper, is that they had a disproportionate role in this too, right? So they're not...
In fact, traditionally, left-wing or communist groups were dominated by Jews. Obviously, the Russian Revolution was largely a Jewish revolution.
They should at least put these facts before you. The reason people were anti-Semitic was they thought, with justification, that the USSR was a Jewish regime that was going to kill Christians.
Yes.
And this is not an unjustified thing to think.
Okay. Bolshevism was largely a Jewish thing. Marx was a Jew. The core people who advanced Bolshevism were Jews, or part Jews, or married to Jews. It was a heavily Jewish phenomenon.
Now, it's not anti-Semitic to say that the Jews were behind communism as a group, not all Jews, but...
We aren't living in, say, Russia of the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. That's often falsely called the Russian Revolution. There's very little Russian about that revolution, but we'll put that aside.
The truth about Jewish involvement in communist movements, particularly Bolshevism in Russia, tends to get grossly exaggerated by the alt-right. For example, 10 years before the Russian Revolution, 4 of the 15 members of the Bolshevik party elite were Jewish, if the half-Jewish Lev Kamenev is counted as he should be, which displays quite significant overrepresentation, but nothing even closely resembling a Jewish dominance over Bolshevism. In this video, we shall undertake a detailed examination of the roles of Jews in the Bolshevik party and government, and in the Russian Revolution. But first we need to take a glimpse at the history of Russia's Jews for the context in which to view the facts. By the early 20th century, Russia had become a vast multinational empire where less than half of the population was ethnically Russian, and belonging to the 56% of non-ethnic Russians were Russian Jews, who comprised about 4% of the total population, while other minorities, such as Ukrainians, Georgians, and Armenians, faced persecution as well. It was only the Jews of Russia who were not, as a rule, allowed to own land, serve in state administration or in high-ranking positions in the army, and whose admission to higher education was limited by the imposition of quotas. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, pogroms during which Russia's Jews became victims of extreme violence, including murder, were far from rarities. The violence was privately endorsed by some Tsarist authorities, including the Tsar himself, who had repealed efforts to end the legal discrimination against Jews. It shouldn't be shocking that this group, which went through such persecution and happened to be on average more literate and urbanized than the rest of the population, except for the ethnic Germans, was disproportionately drawn towards anti-Tsarist revolutionary movements, and they no doubt were welcomed, since the Tsarist persecution meant that a Jewish identity was just about the closest thing to a guarantee that the person couldn't have any connections to the previous regime. It's also worth noting that as left-wing revolutionary movements were gaining prominence, the Russian Empire's other discriminated minorities, who found their nations being victimized by the Tsarist Russification policy, which aimed to erode their national culture and subjugate them to Russian cultural hegemony, became politicized in the same manner. The fact that the oppression was inflicted on national grounds meant that the left-wing revolutionary parties were at the same time the nationalist parties that demanded greater national autonomy as well, and these were the parties to which the minority groups rallied to. Among Russia's Jews, the left-wing nationalist parties were also by far the most popular, but there was a significant portion of secular, more Russified Jews who rejected any form of Jewish nationalism. So instead of joining their national parties like the other minorities, they were joining the Russian socialist parties with roughly equivalent enthusiasm, it can be assumed. It's this combination of persecution, literacy, urbanization, and rejection of the Jewish national parties by the Russified Jews that perhaps best explains the high representation of Jews in the Bolshevik Russian Communist Party, although this is still an oversimplification of a matter that's a bit too complicated to be adequately summarized here. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks established their regime on the basis of the Communist Party and a Soviet government, which consisted of the Council of People's Commissars, later called the Council of Ministers, and the Soviets, or more precisely, a Soviet Executive Committee. In the Bolshevik Russian Communist Party, 5.2% of the members were Jewish, according to the 1922 census, and this was about the same as the percentage of Jews in the Tsarist army in the early 20th century, by the way. However, while the total number of Bolshevik Jews was rather tiny, they tended to reach high-ranking positions. In the Fifth Party Congress, 10 years before the revolution, back when the Bolsheviks were tethered to the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, about 10% of the Bolshevik attendees were Jewish, and after the revolution, in March 1919, 17% of the party congress attendees were Jewish, and the next party congress was 14.5% Jewish. The Central Committee, which was the elite that the Congress would elect to rule over the party in the intervals between Congresses, was about 30% Jewish in 1917 and 1918. By 1921, the Central Committee was 20% Jewish, and by 1939, 10% Jewish. The Political Bureau of the Central Committee, aka the Politburo, which was in the March 1919 Party Congress solidified as the prime authority in policy-making on the party level, was composed of only 5 main members, first of whom was Vladimir Lenin, the undisputed leader of the Bolshevik Party. Lenin was predominantly of ethnic Russian background, but had some German, Jewish, Kalmyk and Swedish ancestry as well. It was Lenin's maternal great-grandparents who were Jews, but one of them was not at all friendly towards Judaism and made sure that their sons converted to Christianity early on. As a Christian, Lenin's grandfather, who had changed his name to Alexander, had no ties to any Jewish traditions, and he married a Christian of German-Swedish background. Lenin was most likely in his late 20s when he learned that he had a Jewish grandparent, but he never considered himself a Jewish person and instead identified himself as Russian. Of the 5 main Politburo members, 3 were Jews: Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, who was actually half Jewish, and Nikolai Krestinsky, who probably was of Jewish background as well. And of the 3 non-voting members, 1 was Jewish, Grigory Zinoviev. In 1922, there were 3 Jews among the 7 main, or 10 total members of the Politburo, and in 1924, Jews still comprised about a third of the Politburo, but with the defeat of Trotsky, Zinoviev and Kamenev, the Politburo gained an ethnic Russian majority in 1927, and an ethnic Russian majority was retained in the Politburo for the rest of the Soviet Union's existence. By 1930, when the worst Soviet mass murders were about to begin, the Politburo had 9 main members, of whom 1 was Jewish. The second most influential and authoritative body in the Soviet Union was the Council of People's Commissars, aka Sovnarkom, which was a cabinet-style government comprised, as the name suggests, of People's Commissars who were each in charge of one of the various government departments or commissariats, like agriculture, trade, education or finance. In 1918 to 1920, there were 21 commissariats and therefore 21 People's Commissars, and of them 3 were Jews. If we count all the people who were working in the Council of People's Commissars, and not just the commissariat chiefs, we find out that around 20% were Jews. By 1936, the percentage of Jewish People's Commissars had risen from that 14% to 30%, and would then drop due to the Great Terror. Since the Soviet Union had been created in 1922, we are, of course, now talking about the All-Union Council of People's Commissars. The chairmanship of the Council of People's Commissars corresponded approximately to Prime Minister, and the position of chairman at first belonged to Lenin, who was predominantly an ethnic Russian as we saw earlier, and his deputy, the ethnic Russian Alexei Rykov, became the chairman after Lenin's funeral. In 1930, Rykov was ousted from the chairmanship and replaced by another ethnic Russian, only this time one that happened to be a top henchman of the new Soviet dictator. Last and least of the organs of power in the Bolshevik regime were the Soviets or workers' councils. Numerous Soviets existed all across Russia after the revolution, and much like the party, Soviet delegates met in a periodical Congress of Soviets where they elected a group of elites called the Central Executive Committee. On paper, this was the highest state body, but in reality it was the weakest part of the state. For the first year and a half or so of Bolshevik rule, back when the Central Executive Committee possessed definitive legislative powers, its chairman was Yakov Sverdlov, who was Jewish and a Central Committee member as well. But in March 1919, Sverdlov died of influenza or typhus, and the position at the head of the Central Executive Committee was granted to the ethnic Russian Mikhail Kalinin, who would occupy it for more than 20 years. In late 1917, of the total number of Bolsheviks in the Central Executive Committee, about 37% were Jews, a figure that doesn't count in all members in this body, since the Bolsheviks had not just yet acquired full hegemony, but is undoubtedly indicative of the prevailing trend. And by the late 1920s, when we are talking about the All-Union Central Executive Committee, the percentage of Jews had declined to 10%. Thus, the Jewish representation in the Central Executive Committee met pretty much the same fate as it did in the Bolshevik Party, meaning it was initially quite significant and then rapidly declined from 1920 onwards. In the Council of People's Commissars, we saw a different trend, one that started out with small percentages but then grew and peaked in the mid-1930s, shortly before the Great Terror. This was also true of the Soviet political police, which was created in December 1917 as the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. The political police would be rechristened multiple times before the collapse of the Soviet Union, but during the first 5 years of Bolshevik rule, it was known simply as the Extraordinary Commission, or CHK, as its Russian acronym was pronounced, and it was headed by the ethnically Polish Felix Dzerzhinsky. Like in the party, many visible positions in the CHK were held by Jews. For example, in the most significant one of the CHK departments, half of the 12 interrogators were Jews, but in overall, a comparatively tiny role in the CHK leadership was played by Jews. In the CHK central apparatus, meaning those in the Lubyanka main office in Moscow, only 3.7% were Jews, and of all the senior positions, 8.6% were in Jewish hands. By 1936, the year when the Great Terror began, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, NKVD, had fully absorbed the functions of the political police, and this was the year when the Jewish portion of the Soviet political police reached its peak with 39% of the senior officers being Jews. But by the time the Great Terror ended in 1939, that figure had been reduced to about 4%. These are all quite astonishing overrepresentations, since Jews were just below 2% of the Soviet population, but not as astonishing as the case of the ethnic Latvians, who constituted 0.1% of the Russian population and yet managed to occupy over 52% of the Cheka senior positions in 1918. This Latvian overrepresentation in the Cheka leadership vastly exceeded any overrepresentation that the Jews ever achieved in the political police leadership. The explanation is largely rooted in the fact that many in Latvia found common ground with Bolshevism in desiring Latvian independence from Tsarist Russia and an end to the Great War. Lenin, who didn't trust Russians to be able to shed blood in the required way, had developed close ties to Latvian communist movements, and thus Latvians were recruited to form the bulk of the Cheka, as well as Red Army leadership at the beginning of the Bolshevik rule. This, of course, doesn't excuse anyone's actions, but it shows how even a seemingly unbelievable overrepresentation, like that of the Latvians, can be explained without having to resort to conspiracy theories or race realism. So why would anyone then feel the need to do that in the case of the Jews, when we already know about the Jewish literacy, Tsarist persecution, and all the other stuff? By 1917, the year of the Russian Revolution, the Tsarist regime was on its last legs. It had failed to improve the conditions of the Russian workers and brutally suppressed the workers' efforts to campaign for a way out of their immiseration. Instead of modernizing the country, it had actively undermined the attempts to modernize it, and the loyalty of the army command was wearing thin, since the Tsarist regime encouraged archaic and ineffective administration of military affairs, which contributed to the already existing demoralization. In January 1917, Russia had been fighting in the First World War for over 2 years, and once the Tsarist regime had mismanaged the food supplies, demonstrations by Russian people in the hundreds of thousands began. The most concerning of these large-scale demonstrations were taking place in Petrograd, formerly known as St. Petersburg, where soldiers on guard joined the demonstrators, and the Petrograd Soviet from 1905 would soon be resurrected. But virtually none of the Tsarist officials had enough faith left in the Tsarist autocracy to come to its aid in this dire moment. Leaders in the Duma, which was like the Russian parliament established in 1905, instead began discussing the possibility of seizing power, as the Tsar was only reacting with passivity to the unrest in Petrograd, where the Soviet was being reconstituted, while Russian generals eventually succeeded in persuading Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. supposedly in the interests of the army. The generals did not desire taking over government responsibilities themselves or abolishing the monarchy, and they instead hoped that power could be transferred to the recently established Provisional Committee of the State Duma, with the Tsar's son taking the throne. The Tsar's son could not claim the throne, and the Tsar's brother then refused to claim it, so the Duma Provisional Committee alone formed the new government, with the Petrograd Soviet playing the role of a representative parliament, only without much authority. The February Revolution brought the first coup of 1917. No one had elected the Provisional Committee that then deliberately delayed the elections they had sworn to prepare, since it was feared that the Russian people would vote against the interests of those in the Duma. The 8-point program that the provisional government adopted with the consent of the Petrograd Soviet Executive Committee granted amnesty to all political prisoners of Tsarism, and thus many leading Russian communists could crawl back from exile. Some of the communist leaders supported the bourgeois revolution, since according to Marxism, Russia had to develop capitalism first before it could transition to socialism and from there to communism. But one such communist was definitely not the leader of the Bolshevik party, Lenin, who argued that Russia was capitalist enough for a dash towards socialism. Upon his return to Russia, Lenin declared his intentions of bringing down the capitalist provisional government in favor of a socialist one, and the chance to do that sort of presented itself in July, when the provisional government, which had not pulled Russia out of the World War, provoked an uprising against itself by launching a military offensive against the Central Powers. The uprising did not cause a collapse in the provisional government, however, and in fact the newly appointed Prime Minister of Russia, Alexander Kerensky, managed to take advantage of the situation by forcing Bolshevik leaders to go back into exile. After the vicissitudes of July, luck turned in favor of the Bolsheviks in August, when the new Prime Minister Kerensky, whose name occasionally appeared in the far-right's anti-Semitic propaganda, despite him not being Jewish, needed assistance from his political opponents in subduing a coup attempt by the army. Basically all of the imprisoned Bolsheviks were freed as the result, including Trotsky, who became the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, and most of the 40,000 guns that Kerensky had distributed in order to resist the army coup ended up on the Bolshevik side, while Kerensky himself assumed dictatorial power. Lenin, who was still hiding abroad, was now confident that power could be seized and demanded an immediate coup, which then took place in October 1917, according to the calendars used in Russia at the time, and would therefore be remembered as the October Revolution. Although Lenin was the one to spearhead the Bolshevik October Revolution, it would be an error to view the October coup as exclusively his handiwork. In bringing down the provisional government and seizing power in October, perhaps no one was as crucial to Lenin as Trotsky, who, if you can remember, was Jewish and had been calling for the overthrow of the provisional government as soon as it had come to power. Lenin had not seen an ally in Trotsky right away, despite agreeing with him on the necessity of another revolution, but in the aftermath of the so-called July days, Trotsky had become a close ally of Lenin, and by leading the Petrograd Soviet and the Military Revolutionary Committee, Trotsky served effectively as Lenin's right hand during the October coup. Another Bolshevik who played a key role in the October coup was the ethnically Georgian revolutionary Joseph Stalin, whose contributions in 1917 would later be severely downplayed in the writings of his hated rival, but in actuality, as the principal power behind Bolshevik propaganda in 1917, Stalin had been paving the way for the October coup by strengthening Lenin's and the Bolsheviks' standing among the masses. Yakov Sverdlov, the Jewish Central Committee member, had his organizing talents recognized by Lenin in April 1917, and Sverdlov was assigned the responsibility of running the secretariat, which made him the man first and foremost responsible for party organization, and as such is the final Bolshevik who ought to be mentioned in relation to the October coup, if we are to remain concise. The October coup was not supported by all strata of the Bolshevik party, and indeed, as an expression of their outrage at the coup, some leading Bolshevik figures resigned from their posts, even if only briefly. Most notably, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Rykov, which provided Lenin greater control over the party and the new government, but meant that in consolidating power over Russia, a process that would last throughout the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 1920, Lenin had to rely upon the same gang of loyalists that had helped him seize power. Lenin himself took over the Council of People's Commissars and blasted the nation with his socialism from there, while Trotsky became the People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs and as a Politburo member participated in other governmental business as well. Stalin became the People's Commissar of Nationalities, which turned out to be beyond vital in the face of the disintegrating Russian Empire, and Sverdlov, who was already running the Secretariat, took charge of the Central Executive Committee and became even more than before the indispensable party organizer, at least until his death in early 1919. By November 1917, it was this group of four who occupied the most important leading positions in the Soviet regime, but this is not to say that the roles of the others in the Central Committee, Politburo, Council of People's Commissars and the Central Executive Committee can be neglected, even if I'm unable to give a more comprehensive account of the October Revolution here. Some, like Felix Dzerzhinsky, who would be responsible for implementing Lenin's mass terror campaign against the Bolsheviks' opponents as the leader of the Cheka, also played a prominent role in the consolidation of power. As we have seen, the February Revolution, meaning the fall of the Tsar and the seizure of power by the Provisional Committee, came about as a consequence of the discontent caused by Tsarist policies with minimal involvement by Jews, and needed only a little push from inside the regime, which the Tsarist generals in turn supplied. The October Revolution was then led by the non-Jew Lenin, whose inner circle of closest allies included some Jews like Trotsky and Sverdlov, but some non-Jews as well, like Stalin, while of the entire Bolshevik party elite, as we saw much earlier, Jews comprised a minority, even though they were well overrepresented. Popular opinion in Russia had, by the end of 1917, shifted far to the left, and in the elections that could finally be arranged in November 1917, the Russian people overwhelmingly voted for socialism. In fact, more than 80% of the votes went to socialist parties, with the Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs, being the party most favored by the Russian voting bloc, and the Bolsheviks coming in at second. From all of this, we can reasonably conclude that while the Jewish contribution to the Russian Revolution was significant, it was far from decisive, since the Tsarist regime was overthrown with next to no help from any disproportionately Jewish political parties or movements, and even if the October coup had not taken place, the elections in November would have in any case brought a socialist government into power, although not necessarily a Marxist one. Changes in the composition of the top Soviet elite occurred in the early 1920s when Stalin became Lenin's successor as the leader of the Soviet regime. Given the topic at hand, this process and its outcomes are worth examining, although I'll try to be quick. When Lenin appointed Stalin the general secretary of the party in early 1922, Stalin attained power that rivaled that of Lenin himself, since Stalin was already a member of the two other Central Committee subcommittees, the Politburo and the Organizational Bureau, and now he led the Secretariat, which was tasked with directing the party. This meant that when Lenin died in January 1924, there wasn't much of a struggle for succession as is sometimes accepted as a truism, since Stalin already held the reins of power, unlike Trotsky, who had rejected the position of deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars that had been offered to him. Lenin and Trotsky had had a complicated relationship, again despite agreeing about the overthrow of the provisional government, and it was only in the summer of 1917 when Trotsky joined Lenin's party, even though the two had known each other since 1902. After the revolution, the seizure of power and civil war were over. Trotsky's relationship with Lenin and his support in party circles deteriorated when he took a stance against the party line maintained by Lenin, who proposed the implementation of the new economic policy, NEP, as a concession to the peasants who had loudly protested the grain requisitions the Bolsheviks had carried out during the Civil War and its aftermath. In short, Trotsky argued that the NEP concession in the challenging conditions of the post-Civil War era was a betrayal of socialism, and instead the building of socialism should begin at the very moment. In 1921, Lenin had called Trotsky a temperamental man who hasn't got a clue when it comes to policy, and in the 1923 Party Congress elections, Trotsky came in at 35th in terms of the number of votes received, while Stalin tied with Lenin for the first place. In sharp contrast to Trotsky, the head of the Council of People's Commissars, Alexei Rykov, was well respected and liked by other Bolshevik party elites and could have been Lenin's successor. Once the Trotsky-led left opposition and the Zinoviev-Kamenev-led Petrograd opposition had been disbanded, the golden opportunity to remove Stalin from the helm of the party presented itself when Stalin made a call for his own resignation as the general secretary of the party one final time. But Rykov, for reasons that to this day remain unclear, insisted that Stalin should stay, and the rest of the party members at the meeting then followed Rykov's example. No such opportunity presented itself ever again. Stalin, as the Soviet dictator, had substantially fewer Jews in his inner circle than did Lenin, who had Trotsky, Sverdlov, and to lesser extent Zinoviev and Kamenev. In the 1920s, Stalin's inner circle was comprised of 8 people: Vyacheslav Molotov, Valerian Kuibyshev, Lazar Gaganovich, the only Jewish guy, Sergo or Grigory or Johnny Gitze, Sergei Kirov, Anatas Mikoyan, Mikhail Kalinin, and Kliment or Klim Varashilev. In the early 1930s, Molotov, Gaganovich, Varashilev or Johnny Gitze and Mikoyan had become Stalin's closest allies, with Molotov and Gaganovich being his most trusted minions. As Kirov, Kuibyshev and or Johnny Gitze died in the mid-1930s, new faces joined Stalin's inner circle and rose to prominence during the Great Terror. These were Andrei Zhdanov, Nikita Khrushchev, Lavrenti Beria, and Georgy Malenkov. None was Jewish. Minor changes would then take place in the 1940s. Nikolai Voznesensky was introduced to the team. Beria and Khrushchev made further headway. The now dead Kalinin was replaced by Nikolai Svernik, and Varashilev fell somewhat out of favor. From the end of the war until Stalin's death in 1953, the crowd that surrounded the despot consisted of the familiar people, plus the new addition Nikolai Bulganin, who was an ethnic Russian like Voznesensky and Svernik, and the overall portion of Jews in the party and government elite continued to decrease, albeit more drastically after the Second World War, to the point where in the 1950s and 60s the portion of Jews at the top of the party or government was minuscule. Many people came and went, as you can see, but Gaganovich was the only Jewish person ever to be included in Stalin's inner circle, since Litvinov doesn't count. People of anti-Semitic political affiliations have never needed more than a few Jews for the cooking up of their conspiracy theories, and this phenomenon will be explored in Part 2. The First World War, the collapse of the Russian monarchy, and the rise of communism and socialism brought Russia to the forefront of many outside observers' attention. Some, like the German regime, which was at war with Russia, saw the revolutionary movements as means to force Russia out of the Great War, and had been showering the Bolsheviks and other anti-war socialist parties of Russia with resources, at least since early 1917. While the German general Ludendorff was most certainly exaggerating later in his memoirs, it's unquestionably the case that without the German regime the Bolsheviks couldn't have disseminated their propaganda as widely as they did. The other, no doubt much more confusion-arousing benefactors of the Bolsheviks seem to have come from Wall Street, especially the non-Jewish owned J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller enterprises that dominated the American financial scene in the early 20th century. Many of the claims about Wall Street funding of the Bolsheviks are blatantly false, like Trotsky receiving a payment of $10,000 during his visit to New York, but others stand on firmer ground, like William B. Thompson, who was the non-Jewish director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, a large stockholder in the Rockefeller Chase Bank, and an associate of the Morgans and the Jewish or part-Jewish Guggenheims, paying $1 million to the Bolsheviks in December 1917, seemingly on behalf of J.P. Morgan, and the Morgans and American industrialists cooperating with the Soviet regime in its early years for their own economic gain. Indeed, profit and control over Russia's resources and whatever markets might be developing as a consequence of the Bolsheviks' economically desperate situation, so that any possible challenge to American monopolies could be nipped in the bud, were some of the main reasons for this unholy alliance, and preventing their capitalist rivals in Germany from exploiting Russia was another. As we have seen, the major roles in this were played by non-Jews, and in the cases where the financier happened to be of Jewish extraction, like the Swedish banker Aschberg, who funneled a part of the German funds to the Bolsheviks, we can only regard their Jewish background as relevant as the non-Jewish background of the non-Jewish financiers. These facts run contrary to the claim about Jewish bankers being the principal benefactors of the Bolsheviks, which is the story the alt-right would try to convince you of in order to confirm the supposed Jewish character of the Russian Revolution and their anti-Semitic worldview about international Jewish forces working together in spite of economic or otherwise ordinary political concerns to undermine white Christian civilization. The person most frequently cited as proof of all of this is the American banker Jacob Schiff, who was well known for his hostility towards the Tsarist regime due to its maltreatment of Jews, and is said to have given financial support to the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 for this reason, but the evidence for his alleged support or funding of the Bolsheviks is lacking. In no small part due to the influence of the famous anti-Semitic propaganda piece Protocols of the Elders of Zion, racism against and conspiracy theories about Jews were gaining popularity in the Western world and would find their way into American intelligence services, where this claim about Jacob Schiff originated. One report compiled by the American Military Intelligence Division in 1918, which was titled Bolshevism and Judaism and leaked into the public, claimed without citing any evidence that Jacob Schiff and other Jewish bankers funded the endeavors of Trotsky, who had visited New York. The absence of evidence should by itself discredit this report, but on top of that, its claims relied only on the say-so of an anonymous source who has since then been identified as an advocate of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion with a background of engaging in anti-Semitic persecution in Russia. Despite the lack of evidence and the general untrustworthiness of these reports, which the previous example aptly demonstrates, their effect was surprisingly widespread, and the claim about Jacob Schiff was championed even by some Western journalists. But having examined the sources, we can safely dismiss this claim. It's unlikely that Schiff ever supported the Bolsheviks. After the February Revolution, when the Tsar was overthrown, Schiff declared his support for the provisional government that granted equal rights to Russia's Jews, since that's all Schiff ever wanted to happen in Russia. And after the October Revolution, Schiff had asked the U.S. Secretary of State to consider requests from Russia for Western intervention against the Bolsheviks. Moreover, when the Bolsheviks seized power in October, Schiff immediately cut off all loans to Russia, and during the Russian Civil War, Schiff had remained a board member of the Russian Information Bureau, located in the United States and established on the orders of the provisional government, which was not a pro-Bolshevik organization and whose members tended to support the anti-communist whites over the communist reds in the Russian Civil War and not recognize the Bolshevik regime as legitimate. These were the same whites that would murder tens of thousands of Russian Jews in pogroms, but Schiff, like many other prominent American Jewish figures, was driven less so by political allegiance than a desire to influence the whites into bringing a halt to the pogroms. Some prominent Jewish figures in Russia too demonstrated enthusiastic support for the whites out of fear of pogroms, but some Jews went out of their way to join the whites, and they would find themselves, as a group, overrepresented in high-ranking positions. In fact, the White Army Soldiers' Committees were nearly 40% Jewish, and this is best interpreted as simply another example of how a disproportionately literate minority disproportionately occupied certain positions, even in right-wing anti-communist spheres. Part 2 ought to be a bit more exciting, since I'm going to be attempting to analyze the mass murders and other atrocities of the Bolshevik regime and the roles of Jews in them. For the alt-right, it wouldn't be enough to point out that Jews were overrepresented in Russia's revolutionary movements and played a role in the Russian Revolution, especially not since it can be demonstrated that by rushing towards revolutionary movements, those Russian Jews in the early 20th century were perhaps only reacting in the same manner any other ethnic group would have reacted under the same circumstances and pressures, which is where the need to find Jewish scapegoats to embody Bolshevik mass murder comes from. So if you want to see more alt-right lies debunked, or if you just happen to be interested in the topic of the Soviet Union, then why not subscribe? And you'll be notified as soon as the next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. I hope